From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Diana, come on up. She is not only your favorite author, but she is the favorite author of the National Book Festival. In the straw vote that the Library of Congress ran, Diana received the most votes of all the authors appearing today, close to 400,000. So hearty congratulations and hooray for her. Now, I'm supposed to introduce her, but rather than be bum-rushed off the stage telling you things you already know, I decided to take another tack. And I went to Diana's website and saw that she had a whole page devoted to answers to the questions that everybody asked me. So I thought what we'd really like to know are answers to the questions that nobody asked her. So I wrote to her ahead of time and asked her a few of those questions, and she gamely and graciously and hilariously at times wrote back the answers to these questions. And I'm just going to share a few of them with you, and maybe they'll prompt some of your own, which Diana will take questions at the end. I asked her what her favorite word is, one that she loves to see and say and use. Her answer, absquatulate, which I looked up and found to mean to leave, especially in a hurry or under suspicious circumstances, and sometimes taking along something or someone. Another question I asked, when did you first see a real man in a quilt? Answer, February 1989 at a Highlands Games in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, we know it must have been a fetching image because it was just 2 years later that the first book in the Outlander series came out, full of kilted Scotsmen. Another question I ask, have your children read your books? Answer, no, none of my kids reads my books. As my eldest daughter said to me, I don't want to read sex scenes written by my mother. And the last one I'll share with you. Which of your characters would you most like to play in a movie version of one of your books? Answer, Black Jack Randall. So please join me in welcoming this accidental novelist, this great imaginer, this character all her own.
Well, thank you very much. It's awfully nice to see so many of you here today. You know, I have hopes of eventually appearing before an audience in Washington, D.C., not looking like a drowned rat, but today is not the day, you know. I've done the book festival 3 times before. The first time it rained all day. The second time it was 96 degrees outside. And while today is very nice outside, it's beautiful, I've spent the last half hour in the book tent signing books, and with all the body heat in there, it's pretty darn humid. So you'll have to pardon the dripping. I'll slow down after a while. Anyway, many thanks. She mentioned that I was an accidental novelist. That's not quite right. I've known since the age of 8 that I was meant to be a novelist, but I came from a very conservative family background. My father was fond of saying to me, well, you're such a poor judge of character, you're bound to marry some bum. I said, so be sure you get a good education so you can support your children. Well, with this going on at home, I thought perhaps I wouldn't announce that I wanted to write novels. It's been kind of an iffy profession. And instead, I went into science. You know, I got assorted degrees, including a PhD. My dissertation was nest site selection in the pinyon jay, Gymnorhinus cyanocephalus. Or as my husband says, why birds build nests where they do, and who cares anyway? But I did still want to write novels, and when I turned 35, I said to myself, well, you know, Mozart was dead at 36. Maybe you better get a move on here. And so I said, fine, gonna write a novel. Okay, up to this point, I had written all kinds of things, including Walt Disney comic books, which will come into the conversation a little later, and you know, annual reports and grant proposals and textbooks and popular science articles and all the stuff that you write as an academic. I was a university professor. And no one had ever shown me how to write any of this. I had just tried it, and if it didn't look quite right, I poked it till it did. And I said, well, okay, fine. You've been reading novels for 30-odd years. Surely if you write one, you will recognize it. I said, Okay, going to write a novel for practice. And only 2 rules. I will keep doing it until it's finished, no matter how bad I think it is, because how else will I learn? And the second rule is I will do the absolute best that I can with the writing every day, because otherwise, how will I know if I'm any good and how will I get any better? So those were my only rules. So the next question, of course, was what am I going to write? And because I read everything and lots of it, so I thought about that. And I said, well, I maybe read more mysteries than anything else. Perhaps I should write a mystery. And I said, no, mysteries have plots. I'm not sure I can do that. And I said, what's the easiest possible thing to write for practice? And after a bit of thought, I decided that would be a historical novel. I was a university professor. I knew my way around a library. It seemed easier to look things up than to make them up. And if I turned out to have no imagination, I could steal things from the historical record, which actually works pretty well. And so I said, fine, historical novel. Well, where shall I set this? Because I have no background in history, just the 6 hours of Western civilization they make you take as an undergraduate. And so I would have to look up everything anyway. So I was looking for a convenient time and place to set this novel, and I happened to see a really old rerun of Doctor Who on public television. As for those who are not laughing, Doctor Who is a really old, really long-running science fiction fantasy show. The doctor of the title is a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey who travels through space and time having adventures, and along the way he picks up companions from different periods of Earth's history. And in this very old show, which has to have been filmed 50 years ago, it's filmed in the UK, he had picked up a young Scotsman from 1745. And this was a 17, 18-year-old young man who appeared in his kilt. And I said, well, that's kind of fetching. And I said, well, you know, if I found myself still thinking about this the next day in church, and I said to myself, you want to write a book, it doesn't really matter where you set it. The important thing is to pick a point and start in. So I said, fine, Scotland, 18th century. So that's where I began, knowing nothing about Scotland or the 18th century, having no plot, no outline, and no characters. Just the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt, which is, of course, a very powerful and compelling image. In fact, my next to last book, Breath of Snow and Ashes, was a very lucky book for me. It opened at #1 on the bestseller lists of several countries, and it also won me several awards, including the Corina International Prize for Fiction, which was totally cool. And I got to go to Germany to accept this. Well, while I was there, the German publisher had me interviewed by absolutely everyone in the German press, one after another, every half hour, for a week. And toward the end of this process, I was talking to a nice gentleman from one of their literary journals, and he said, oh, I've read your entire work. They're just marvelous. You know, your narrative drive is tremendous. Your imagery is just transcendental. Your characters, they're so three-dimensional. I'm thinking, yes, yes, go on. And instead, he said, there's just this one thing. I wonder, could you explain to me what is the appeal of a man in a kilt? Well, I was really tired, or I might not have said it, but I just looked at him for a minute, and I said, well, I suppose it's the idea that you could be up against a wall with him in a minute. Yeah. The last time I told this story in Denver a couple of nights ago, there was a gentleman sitting in the front row in a kilt, and I said, you're going to regret this. But as I say, very powerful and compelling image. So anyway, that's where I began, and that's where Outlander started. So to date, there are a number of Outlander novels out. No one is quite sure what to call them. Nobody knows quite what it is I write, except that it's really big. And I've seen them sold successfully so far as fiction, literature, historical fiction, historical nonfiction. This is true. Foyle's bookstore in London had them in the history section. And when I mentioned this to the clerk, he said, oh, well, that would be Miss Kitty Foyle, who at the time was about 92. He said, she has complete sway over where books are shelved, and evidently she believes in time travel. So historical fiction, historical nonfiction, science fiction, fantasy, mystery, romance, gay and lesbian fiction, military history, and horror. No, really, the same year with that same book, I was nominated for a Quill Award, and for reasons known only to the people who nominate things, they put the book in the science fiction, fantasy, and horror category, where I was up against George R.R. Martin and Stephen King. I was thinking, oh, great. But they had a lovely award ceremony, which was televised from the Natural History Museum in New York. So I dressed up and was wearing one of my best outfits with the suede boots with the 4-inch heels and all that, which I can stand up in for about 3 hours. And that's about how long they kept us out in the foyer while they did all the TV setup. So by the time we got inside and sat down at the tables, I unzipped my boots and took them off under cover of the tablecloth. So I was enjoying myself through the program. Now, science fiction, fantasy, and horror was the last thing on the program, and as the time got shorter, I was thinking, well, now should I put my boots back on? Then I'd look at George, who was on the other side of the table. I don't know if you've ever seen George R.R. Martin. He looks like an enraged Ewok, but but he's really a very nice man. And he was wearing a purple brocade vest. He's about 3 feet across. And I was thinking, surely the TV cameras won't pass that up. And there was Stephen King on the other side, and I was thinking, nah. And so sure enough, I won and was obliged to scamper up on stage in my bare feet. I could just about see over the podium, and I said, well, now you all know the terrible truth. I'm short. But anyway, I have a hard time describing what it is that I write, but I'm glad that so many of you seem to like to read it. As I said, they tend to be big. That's because I wrote the first book for practice. I didn't intend ever to show it to anyone, let alone try to publish it, and so I didn't pay any attention to what was marketable or commercial or whatever. I just put in anything I liked. Now, it was a perfectly straightforward historical novel up to about the third day. I had gone to the library to do the research or to get started on it. And I said, well, the only thing I know about writing a novel is it should have conflict. I said, so I'm looking for conflict in Scotland in the 18th century. Well, you don't do that for very long before you run right into Bonnie Prince Charlie. And I said, yeah, that looks like a lot of conflict. We'll do that. I said, now I must have a lot of Scotsmen, of course, because of the kilt factor. But I think it would be a good idea if I had a female character to play off these guys, and we'll have sexual tension. That's conflict. That's good. And I said, now, essentially, putting aside the political complexity, we have English versus Scots. So if I make her an English woman, we will have lots of conflict. So the third day of writing, I introduced this English woman. No idea who she was, how she got into the story, or what she was doing there. But I loosed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. Well, she walked in. They're all crouched around the hearth muttering to each other, and they all turned around and stared when she walked in. And I was thinking, why does she look funny? What's going on here? Anyway, one of them slowly drew himself up, and he said, my name's Dougal Mackenzie, and who might you be? And without my stopping to think, I just typed, my name's Claire Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you? And I said, well, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person. So I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her speak like an 18th century woman. But she wasn't having any of this. She just kept making smart-ass modern remarks about everything she saw. And she also took over and started telling the story herself. And so I said, well, I'm not going to fight with you all the way through this book. I said, no one's ever going to see this. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do. Go ahead and be modern. I'll figure out how you got there later. And so it's all her fault that there's time travel in these books. But having made that decision, obviously anything went, including the Loch Ness Monster and a few other questionable items. And so I arrived with this book, which is completely indescribable and has remained so for all these years. My own beloved editor used to say, these have to be word-of-mouth books because they're too weird to describe to anyone. Which is completely true. But it's caused me a lot of trouble with booksellers because for lack of any better idea, they started shoving it in the romance section because there was an identifiable love story amongst everything else. And I said, well, this is fine. I like well-written romance and so forth, but that's not what I write. And anyway, it took me years to make them take it out of the romance section because, as I said, people who read romance will certainly go to the fiction shelves, but the reverse is not true, and you will cut off the entire male half of my audience if you do that. Men like the books, and they see different things in them than women do. And I must say that I'm extremely gratified to see so many gentlemen in the audience, because evidently the word of mouth has been working. Anyway, today I'm here with a quite different book. It is, in fact, part of the Outlander series, but for once, it's short, just to prove that I actually can do a short book. Of course, it's short because it's a graphic novel. And you know what they say about a picture being worth 1,000 words. If that's actually true, then it is actually about the same size as my others. It just fits in a smaller space. I mentioned writing comic books for Walt Disney back in the 70s. This happened because my mother taught me to read at the age of 3, in part by reading me Walt Disney comics. And I never stopped. In my late 20s, I was reading one day, and I said, well, this is pretty bad. I bet I could do better than that myself. And so I found the name and address of the editor who handled that line, and I wrote him this very rude letter saying, dear sir, I've been reading your comics for the last 25 years. They've been getting worse and worse. I said, I don't know if I could do better myself, but I'd like to try. Well, luckily, I had hit Del Connell, a gentleman with a sense of humor, who wrote back and said, okay, try. And he sent me a couple of pages of a sample script so I could see how to lay one out. I wrote him a story, He didn't buy it, but he did something much more valuable. He told me what was wrong with it. I wrote my second story, which he did buy. That was my first fiction sale ever, and I bounced off the walls literally for days. But I continued to write for him for about 3 years, at the end of which the Disney powers that be said, well, we've got 40 years of classic Carl Barks scripts in the files. Why are you buying new ones? Why don't we just recycle those? So they did, and that was the end of my comics career. But, you know, I enjoyed the form. I really liked it. And so when graphic novels kind of began to seep into the mainstream a couple of years ago, I said to my agent, well, you know, if anyone would ever like me to write a graphic novel, I'd be thrilled. A month later, along came Betsy Mitchell of Ballantine Books, who said, would you like to write a graphic novel? I said, well, yes, I'd like that very much, Betsy. And what she said to me was, I want a new Jamie and Claire story, you know, one that's never been seen before, but I want it to be set within the parameters of Outlander. And I said, well, that's interesting. Let me think about that for a bit. And so I did. Well, Outlander is called that, of course, because of Claire Beecham Randall Fraser, who is an Outlander in every sense of the word. You know, she's fish out of water, out of time, doesn't speak the language, knows nothing of the clans that are surrounding her, knows nothing of 18th century politics. Consequently, there's a lot going on around her that she doesn't see, doesn't understand, or is purposely kept ignorant of. And I said, what if I told that story from the point of view of someone who knew everything she doesn't know? Okay, now probably you have seen a graphic novel or a comic book, whether you read them regularly or not. At the top of the first page, you'll see a very large square, a panel, and this is what you call the setup panel. This is where you introduce the main character or a main character from the story in a situation that has something to do with the story. Okay, on the front page of the Exile, which is the new book, you will see what looks like a big square of swirling blue, and if you look closer, you'll see it's a thrashing sea and a lowering sky, and a stark Scottish cliff at one side with a little kilted figure at the top leaning on his sword. Well, he's looking out to sea, and coming through the mist and spray is a small sailing ship. Well, this is Murtaugh, Jamie Fraser's godfather, and he's waiting for Jamie to come back from France. So this story begins before Outlander begins, and we will learn what sent Jamie back from France and a few other things. And the story is told largely from the point of view of Murtaugh and Jamie. So we see, you know, all the things that Claire didn't see, including what Murtaugh thought of Claire when he first saw her, and what he thought of her marrying Jamie and so forth. But we will also, along the way, pick up and solve a few little mysteries that people have been asking me about over the year. It's like, what did Mrs. Fitzgibbons think of Claire's underwear? And, and what happened to Claire's shoes? Claire's shoes are sort of the Where's Waldo of this book. The answer to that question is in there, but you have to look closely to find them again. Okay, so anyway, this is where the Exile came from. Well, the next question, of course, is who's going to draw the pictures, because it's not going to be me. And I wrote the script, of course. I laid it out. And the way you lay out a comic script, or the way I do it, is to actually draw the boxes on the page for the different panels. At the top, I put a description of what I want to be going on in that panel, and include things like the focus and the placement of characters and the expressions on their faces, any particular objects that should be there. It's pretty explicit. And under that, I put the dialogue in script form. Well, this then goes to an artist, and the artist, of course, is pretty critical here. Well, I went back to New York and spent an afternoon with Betsy and her merry band of graphic novelists going through an entire room full of samples of art from graphic novels and comic books, and they were saying, we like this, and I was saying, I like that, and we came to a meeting on several criterion that we agreed on. And they sent me a week later a pile of samples from 10 artists who matched both of our criteria, and who were also available for the 2 years it would take to draw this. It took me 6 months to write the script, so in fact I was not taking time away from writing book 8. I finished it before I finished Echo in the Bone. But it took the artist, Hoang Nguyen, 2 years to finish the artwork, and you can see why if you look at it. I chose him for his sheer painterliness. He does beautiful things with light and composition, but he also has an exquisite touch with faces and with expressions. Now, if you've seen graphic novels very much, mostly the characters only have 2 expressions. They're either completely deadpan, or they're going, and I was saying, well, no, this won't do, you know, scowls won't cut it here. We need expressions to carry the emotion here. And so that's why I chose Hoang, was that he could actually do that. And he's done it, you know, just beautifully. Now, people say, well, you know, this is what I think Jamie looks like, or that's not what I think Claire looks like, but if that's what Diana thinks they look like, okay, this is not what Diana thinks they look like. This is as close as we could come as an approximation. It is a graphic novel. That means it is essentially cartoons, though very sophisticated cartoons. The art is not meant to be an accurate figuration of what Jamie or Claire looks like, and in fact they look quite different from panel to panel, just as real people would if you took photographs of them every 30 seconds. Whoop. I don't know if that's going to cause a problem or not, but I better put it back. the drawbacks of waving your hands when you talk. Anyway, I think we're all good now. Yeah, so anyway, what we did was I explained to Hoang what the characters looked like. He did approximations of them. I said, no, more nose, curlier hair. You know, I continued to say more nose, curlier hair through the entire thing. Hoang is a wonderful artist. He's a Vietnamese American. He came to the U.S. when he was 9 years old. In fact, I just met him for the first time this last week. He came for the launch party so that we could talk to the audience about both the art and the drawings. And he told me his dad worked for the U.S. Embassy, and in fact, his family made it out on that last day. So, yeah, but anyway, he says he likes to draw on both sides of his heritage, so to speak, from the Vietnamese and also from the more Western milieu in which he grew up. And you can see it in the delicacy and the elegance of what he does. But possibly coming from an Asian background and so forth, all of his characters tended to have rather flat noses. And so I kept saying, no, Jamie has a long, pointy nose, you know, and so we got that for the most part, but there are still places in there where he looks a little flat to me. Anyway, you know, nothing is absolutely perfect. You're not seeing what I see when I see Jamie and Claire, but you're seeing a reasonable approximation of them. And as I mentioned at the end of the book, if you could see inside my head, if you could see exactly what I see, every single one of you would say, but they don't look like that. So I don't think that it will disrupt your own mental images of them, and I hope you'll enjoy the art as it is. I should pause at this point and see if any of you have any questions, since we have about 8 minutes remaining here. Yes, I see someone waving back there. Sassenach. The question was, you know, can I say this unpronounceable word that Jamie calls Claire? It's pronounced Sassenach, and it means an outlander, specifically an English person. Yeah, yeah, you're welcome. Anything else? Surely that can't be the only question. Oh, how many more? Well, I don't actually know. I don't plan the books out ahead of time. I don't write with an outline, and I don't write in a straight line. I write where I can see things happening, and then these little pieces kind of stick together, and eventually I get a shape. All of my books have geometric shapes inside, and once I've seen the shape, then the writing becomes much faster because I can kind of see the pieces that are missing. But it takes me 18 months to 2 years to get to that point, and it does take me 2 to 3 years to write one of these books. It usually is a little longer than that between books because there's so much travel and promotion to be done. As I say to people, you have a choice. You can have the next book sooner, or you can look at me. You're looking at me? Yes, somebody back there. Oh, what led me to choose Lord John as a spin-off character to write a series about? Well, that was an accident. Some years ago, I was invited to submit a short story to a book about short stories of historical crime. And I said, well, that's interesting, because I did originally want to write a mystery. I'd love to do that. And I said, sure, you know, why not? But then I began to think, I can't write a short story about Jamie and Claire because of the way in which I work. You know, if I wrote something that was significant enough of an event to make a good short story, then that would be kind of a rock in my way. I'd have to take account of that circumstance when I worked on my next book, and I just didn't want to complicate things. And so I said, well, but you know, there's Lord John. I could write about him because he's a fascinating character. He talks to me easily, and yet he's not constantly in the main story. He drops in and out, and obviously he's having an interesting life during those periods when he's not on stage, so why don't I write about one of those? And so I did. Well, it was a good story, but it was a British anthology, which meant it went out of print like that. And people in the U.S. began saying, well, we've heard about this story. We love Lord John. Where can we get this? And I said, but I said, well, I enjoyed writing that story. You know, what if I wrote another one or two just as time and inspiration allowed? Then we could, you know, collect them and people could have them if they like Lord John. So I did. I wrote a second Lord John story, and I mentioned it to my agents as I was on my way out of the country for a book tour. And I said, oh, I've written the second Lord John short story. And they said, oh, good. How long's this one? And I said, well, I knew you'd ask, so I looked. It's about 85,000 words. I need maybe 5 more to finish it up. They looked at each other, and they looked at me and said, that's the size that normal books are. And evidently I had written a novel without realizing it. And so they took it away and sold it to everyone. And everyone said, oh, here's a new Gabaldon book, and it's short. They were thrilled. And they said, can she do that again? And my agents, being good agents, said, oh, I'm sure she could. And they promptly gave us a 3-book contract to write more Lord John books. So that's where he came from. Yeah, I didn't actually do it on purpose, but, you know, I enjoy him very much. Yeah.
I have a...
Oh, you have one here.
Question, your process. Do you get up every morning and go in a special place and write?
Oh,
or
process.
Do you write at night?
I write at night.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, no, my well, let's see, let's put it this way. When I began writing Outlander, I had 2 full-time jobs. I was a university professor, and I wrote almost full-time freelance for the computer press, and I had 3 children under the age of 6. The youngest of those is over here on the grass, now 24. So anyway, I wrote at night is basically the answer there. But I'm normally a night owl anyway. So now that the kids are all grown and so forth, and I don't have either of my 2 full-time jobs, I normally go to work around midnight. Midnight to 4 a.m. is my main time. But, you know, my husband likes to go to bed fairly early, around 9:30 or 10, so usually, you know, I'll tuck him in, and then I'll go lie down on a couch with the 2 dachshunds and a book, and if no one needs me, these days they mostly don't, I'll fall asleep. But I'll wake up again naturally around midnight and go to work, and then I go back to bed at 4.
So basically that's your creative time. That's very
That's my main time, yeah. I will write during the day as well, but usually only an hour here and an hour there, and I do research and other things during the day.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yes.
3 generations of my family are now hooked on your books.
Thank you.
And when they heard I was coming here today, the one question all of them asked was, when's the next Outlander book?
Well, The Exile is an Outlander book, but I know what they mean. They want book 8, yes. I was just thinking about the 3-generation thing. I was signing books in Chicago once and had a grandmother, mother, and daughter who were all reading the books, and I was signing for them. The grandmother was talking to me, and she said, you know, I was in the middle of Voyager when I turned to my granddaughter and said, I've just had a terrible thought. We're both lusting after the same man. Yeah. Anyway, the rough answer to your question is with luck in 2012, I think, yeah. You will have a book next year, I think, because the 3rd book under my Lord John contract, Lord John and the Scottish Prisoner, I work on multiple things at once because it keeps me from having writer's block. And as the Lord John books are substantially shorter, that's likely to be done first. So my guess is that you'll get that next fall, so you will have something to read. Now, that's called Lord John and the Scottish Prisoner, and it is a 2-person book. It alternates in viewpoint between Jamie Fraser and Lord John, so I think you'll enjoy that. And then with luck, book 8 will be out the following year, we hope. Okay, we have time for maybe one more question? Or? Oh, over here? Who is he pointing at? Oh, there you are. Sorry.
Can you give us an update on the movie/TV series?
Oh, can I give you an update on movies? Really quick, yeah. Yes, the books are under contract, under an option contract. Now, that does not mean they're actually making a movie. It means that they want to make a movie, and they're looking for $60 million in which to do it. So they have hired a scriptwriter, and I'm talking to them in San Francisco next week. So with luck, I'll have some news for you at that point, and if I do, I'll put it on my website. The next question, which I can answer without hearing it, is who would you cast to play Jamie Fraser? Okay, up to about a month ago, I had no answer to that, but now I do. Okay, you've never heard of him, but this is a very nice young Edinburgh gentleman named Alan Scott Douglas, a very fine actor. He is 6'4", he does have red hair, and he is Scottish. He's also 27, and I think he might actually remember what it's like to be a virgin. Yes, do we have 30 seconds for another question? No, we're done. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much, and I'll see you for signing later. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.